would like to share some slides. And I hope I have permission to share my screen. And I should also say that Richard has really prepared the ground for me. So there will be a lot of connection to Richard's talk earlier. So I will try to share my screen now. So there we are. So first of all, I cannot not take the opportunity to do a little bit of promotion of my foundation in Sweden. So 2 words about my background. Originally a mathematician and physicist, and then I've been working as an investment banker for almost the whole of my active business life. When I was 50, I had the opportunity to sell my banking business and decided to create my own foundation in Stockholm called the Oak Island Foundation, or Ekskäret Foundation. And we have our own island, as you can see on this picture, outside Stockholm, where we try to, both in practical terms, but also more philosophical, explore the connection between our personal, inner growth and development, and societal change. And as you kindly mentioned, I've written 3 books. The Market Myth, when I came out of the banking world 10 years ago. The Nordic Secret, written together with my colleague and friend Lena Andersson in Copenhagen. And then finally, my latest book, The World We Create. And my short presentation today will both feature material from The World We Create and from the Nordic Secret. And of course, I want to take the starting point, as we so often do in the rapidly changing times we are living in. Technological development has certainly a very big role to play in this rapid change. And we sometimes talk about this VUCA world, that the world is becoming more volatile, uncertain, complex, and with a rising ambiguity. And of course, this is creating a lot of stress. We have had technological change, of course, throughout the whole history of humanity. But this is really the first time when technological change is going so rapidly that we really need to reinvent our lives, perhaps even every 10 years now, perhaps even every 5th year, because of the rapid technological change. It's also the first time we as humanity are facing the terrible effects of our impact on the environment. And it's also the first time as a potential where we might be able to go from a world characterized by scarcity to a world of abundance, even within planetary boundaries. But given all these possibilities and challenges we have at the moment, we are really living through extraordinary times. And I sometimes speak about the fact that we are actually living in a meta crisis. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that all the different crises that we see in the world today, like the environmental crisis, the terrorist threats, the political breakdown of democracy that we are seeing happening in many places right now, obesity crisis, fake news, all of these crises are actually just symptoms of one underlying meta crisis. And that meta crisis, to me, is the fact that we have now outgrown the way that we look at the world. We have outgrown our worldview. And as Richard mentioned, throughout the human history, we have actually changed consciousness, shifted consciousness, and shifted worldview a number of times. And I believe that we are now at such a moment again where we need to change our worldview and our consciousness. And of course, the pandemic that we are living through right now is just adding additional fuel to this process. So how do we change worldview? How do we change paradigm? This model here is from the Björkman Institute in the US, and I find it quite helpful. It points out that we are coming from an old paradigm and moving into a new paradigm. And the last time we really did this in the human history was during the Enlightenment, when we went from an old paradigm that came from the early Middle Ages, perhaps had its peak during the high Middle Ages, and then technological development happened. We got the printing press, not just the printing press, but certainly the printing press played a very, very important role in outgrowing that old paradigm, the paradigm of religious dogmatic thinking. And of course, we went into a period of rapid chaos. We had the French Revolution and we had the Napoleonic Wars, and the whole of Europe was in turmoil for 50, almost 100 years. But then out of that chaos came a new paradigm. And that is, of course, the paradigm that we today call modernity. But we should also remember that these paradigm shifts are not always successful. So I often view culture and our society as a self-organizing, complex process. And as every self-organizing complex process, when that system comes under pressure, it can go two ways. You reach what in complexity science is called the bifurcation point. And we can either have a step up in complexity to come to a more complex, but also often more elegant way of ordering the system, or the system will break down. So we really reach this point of either breaking through or breaking down. And I think that's where we are today. We are rapidly approaching that point. And then, of course, we are at this paradigm shift again. And this time, the old paradigm is modernity. That, at least in the Nordic countries, I think we could say had its peak during the 70s or early 80s. And then again, technological development, the internet, not just internet, has put the world in turmoil, in chaos. We have again outgrown a paradigm, a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at ourselves, a way of relating to each other. And something new wants to be born. And this new, we don't know what it is. And of course, any such phase transition in a complex system is emergent. And that means that per definition, we do not know what will come out. And we cannot steer this process. We cannot manage it. We cannot control it. But I believe that we can facilitate it. We can increase the odds for a breakthrough rather than a breakdown. And we could say that in this critical point in time, there is a need for conscious leadership. And the challenge to global leadership in organizations, but certainly also in society, is that the increase in complexity in our outer world has somehow to be matched by an increase in complexity in our inner world. And if it's one thing I want you to remember from this talk, it is this, that the increase in complexity of our outer world has to be matched by an increase in complexity in our inner world. And then complexity here is a word that has many, many dimensions. That for me includes, for example, also our capacity to extend empathy and to navigate a multicultural world and all of those aspects. It's all the aspects that helps us to relate to each other in deeper, new ways. And of course, in passing, I should mention that this is true for any system. Even an authoritarian system needs to increase its complexity when the complexity of the world is rising. And that is why the Soviet Union broke down, of course. But this challenge is even more important to understand from a perspective of democracy. Because in a democratic system, it is so important that a large part of the population develop a higher degree, a higher complexity of sense-making. And that is really the fundamental insight of some very, very insightful politicians and intellectuals in the Nordic countries 150 years ago that Richard was referring to, and that Lena and I are telling the story about in our book, The Nordic Secret. So what is this all about, the Nordic Secret? Well, Richard has already given part of it away, so I can tell you more about how it actually happened. So Richard was referring to this diagram, and I'm sure most of you might have seen it, the World Value Study diagram. And Richard pointed out that the Nordic countries have a very extreme position in this diagram. Stefan and Richard was also discussing the question, how does values and consciousness, how does consciousness relate to values? And that is, of course, very complicated because you can be socialized into certain values without actually owning them yourself. But if you should really own the values in yourself and have them in a self-authoring way, the way that Richard was calling the individuated way, when you actually find the values not outside yourself, but inside yourself, then there is a strong correlation between consciousness and values. And in that respect, that corner of this diagram somehow represents a more conscious society, even if we should be careful about expressing it that way. So then what made the Nordic countries end up in that corner? Well, it's easy to forget that 150 years ago, at the end of the 1800s, all the Nordic countries were among the poorest, non-democratic agrarian societies in Europe. And in Sweden, back then, 30% of the working population actually emigrated to the US because of the hardship in the country. It was almost as many as, for example, in Ireland, and we had our famine back then as well. But then, just a few generations later, even before the Second World War, we were at the top of all the measurements of the richest, the happiest, the most stable industrial democracies. And there were, of course, many reasons for this development. But one reason, and a bit forgotten reason, even in the history books in the Nordic countries, was this emphasis on consciousness development, broad scale consciousness development. And as I mentioned, we had these visionary politicians and intellectuals who actually understood that in times of rapid societal change, it is just so easy for us humans to want to have an external authority to hold on to. We might want to hold on to a dogmatic religion or to an authoritarian leader. But these politicians, they didn't want to be authoritarian leaders. That they were firmly committed to building democracy. And they knew that the only way to build stable democracies are to build them from bottom up. So they wanted to create a lot of conscious co-creators of modernity. People who had actually, again, using Richard's language, gone through the process of individuation, or in the language of the developmental psychologist, Professor Robert Keegan at Harvard, who had developed a capacity for self-authoring. If you do that, you are able to hold your own values, even during turbulent times of rapid social change, without seeking an external authority. And the way they did this was quite extraordinary, because what they did was that they created what today might best be described as retreat centers. And they created many of them. So when this program started around 1860, it started in Denmark. Norway followed quite rapidly, and then this moved on to Sweden. And the numbers of centers grow rapidly. So by the turn of the last century, 1900, there were actually 100 centers just in Denmark, 75 centers in Norway, and 150 centers in Sweden, where young adults, usually in their 20s, later on with full state subsidy, could spend up to 6 months in retreat, with the expressed aim of going through or starting an individuation process, a consciousness development process, to become grounded enough in themselves to be able to go out in society and act as conscious co-creators of the new society that wanted to be born. And when this program was at its height, actually 10% of each young generation participated in one of these half-year-long programs. And of course, that created some sort of critical mass in these societies. And this is what one of these centers at the start could have looked like. This is a typical building. There were relatively small centers for 40 up to 60 people living together, reading together, spending time in nature together, singing together, but most importantly, talking together and exchanging ideas and perspectives and challenging each other a little bit in a very safe and friendly environment. For those that were not able to participate in a 6-month retreat, a complementary program was developed that we might call self-facilitating groups. So everywhere, or in many, many places in the Nordic countries, these groups, without a formal leader, group size around 8 to 16 people, came to meet weekly with the same purpose of studying literature, singing together, spending time in nature, but most importantly, talking together and exploring perspectives on the world that was about to emerge. These ideas came from the German idealist philosophers. That is where the original ideas come. We have here Goethe and Schiller. And they used, as Richard said, the German word Bildung to describe this process of consciousness development. And of course, we should remember that all these idealist philosophers that are to a large extent forgotten today, at least as philosophers, both Goethe and Schiller are more today remembered as literature figures, as poets and playwrights. But they reacted very strongly against the Enlightenment philosophers' view of our mind as a rational machine. They said, our mind is not a rational machine. Our mind is an organic, developing system that is both embodied in the totality of our bodies and embedded in culture. And this organic developing mind can actually grow in consciousness throughout life. And that process can be facilitated. And that is what they meant by Bildung. I know that my allotted time is out in 2 minutes. I just want to show a speculative slide at the end, talking a little bit about this paradigm shift where we are right now. And this can also serve as thought for questions or discussion. So I said that the new paradigm we are moving into is emergent and we cannot know so much about it. But I still want to speculate a little bit. And I want to use the value survey as a speculation. And I want to shrink this value space now that before covered the whole screen. And there we could almost think that the Nordic countries had reached the end of value development. Now, I want to shrink this and put this into perspective. And first of all, say that we shouldn't forget that 250 years ago, all cultures were in this smaller space that I just put up on the screen. And what happened during the Enlightenment and the process was that we moved from this space that Richard was talking about survival values and with a religious worldview. And we broke out of that space into modernity with self-expression values and a secular scientific worldview. I believe that we can gain some insight into the transition we are right now in if we can see that we are right now about to break out of the present square into a new space, into a larger box. And what could define that larger box? Well, I believe that on the individual value side, we might go from survival to self-expression to self-transcendence. And I think we can see that in a small part of the population already. And on the worldview side, we go from the religious to the secular to a holistic or integral, or what some people might even call a meta-modern worldview. I will give you 2 sources to read about this. And there are 2 small booklets that are available free of charge to be downloaded from my foundation's website. The first one is about developing the new perspectives, and it's called Changing the World We Create. So what are the new perspectives that we are developing that will help us in this transition? And on the other axis, on the individual values, we need to develop new values or new transformative skills. And we have already mentioned many of these already in the talks today. And again, we have a small PDF booklet, download free of charge, that is called On the Becoming of Conscious Co-Creators, that describes how these transformative skills can be defined and also how they can be developed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. That was very enlightening. And I mean, I think somebody mentioned in the chat, no idea that this Nordic approach existed, and what a wonderful way to help people with that whole individuation process.
Oh yeah, and that's why it's called The Secret. I mean,
Yes.
even in the Nordic countries, we lost the understanding of these, what we were doing in these centers. Many of them still exist, but they are more now considered adult education centers rather than individuation centers.
And I find it fascinating that people had to come together to individuate.
Yeah, yeah. If we have time,
Yes.
I might want to mention why we have Rosa Parks on the cover of the Nordic Secret.
Yes.
Do we have time for that?
Yes.
If it's very brief.
Yes, okay. So this concept actually traveled to the US. And Rosa Parks has in many interviews said that what gave her the strength and the inner moral compass to know that she had the moral right to remain sitting in the bus in Alabama, even though the law of the land said that she should give it up to that white person, was the fact that she had participated in one of these retreat centers, one of these Scandinavian retreat centers. Because this concept traveled from Denmark by a guy called Miles Horton, who went to Denmark, spent a year there, learned the concept, and then started 4 centers like this in the US. And the most famous of them is called the, okay, anyhow, in Tennessee. This center in Tennessee. And at this center, both Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and many of the important people in the civil rights movement spent time to finding their inner compass. So yeah, the Highlander Folk School is what the center in Tennessee is called. So yeah, so I don't think, finishing, that what we have here is a blueprint for what we need to do today, the Nordic Secret, but I think it's a case study showing that systematically focusing on large-scale consciousness development in society is not just a new bright idea. It is something that has been tried in 3 or 4 countries more than 100 years ago, and it worked.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story. I got chills when you talked about her and that transfer of information. That's really beautiful.
Yeah,
so Stefan, I think we'll move into the break.
Yeah, I just want to say, Thomas, if such center had existed in Canada and I went to it, I wouldn't have had to go through so much pain and suffering to finally individuate and get to my soul essence. So I'm on a path now to maybe find a way for young people to have such a rite of passage to maybe find out about who they truly are before they get to 50 years old.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell the story.